This is English for Real People, a journey into clear, authentic English, explained slowly, calmly, and with purpose, where every episode brings you closer to understanding the language in its natural form. Welcome.
If you completely freeze up when you're trying to speak a second language, you probably think you just have a vocabulary problem.
Right. Yeah, that's what everyone assumes.
Like you think you just need to study more flashcards.
Yeah.
But you don't. You actually have a nervous system problem.
Exactly. It's a biological issue, not a lack of effort.
So welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at some fascinating research that proves your brain's, well, its evolutionary drive to be efficient is actually the exact mechanism that's causing your linguistic system to crash.
It really is a profound paradigm shift when you get into it.
Yeah, I mean, the mission for this deep dive is to unpack the cognitive science and the actual, practical strategies behind eliminating something called mental translation.
Because most learners hit that agonizing wall, right? Where the perfect thought is fully formed in their head, but their jaw just absolutely refuses to move.
Yes. Oh my gosh, it's the worst feeling.
It really is. And they diagnose it as a lack of study. They assume their internal lexicon is just too small.
But the source of material we're looking at today proves that adding more flashcards to a structurally flawed processing system is entirely useless.
It's basically like giving a crashed computer more files to manage. It doesn't fix the blue screen.
Exactly. So we're going to figure out how to bypass your native language completely so you can think directly in your target language. And specifically today, we're talking about English.
Right. And to do that, we really have to treat the bilingual brain not as some, metaphysical container of words, but as a biological engine.
An engine with very specific processing limits.
Precisely. We need to look under the hood at the computational load of human speech.
Because when that freeze happens, it's not a memory lapse. It is a literal bottleneck.
Yeah, your brain is attempting to execute a background process that just completely exceeds the capacity of its working memory buffer.
So let's get right into the mechanics of that bottleneck. Because the sources outline this, well, it's a 4-step cognitive trap that almost everyone falls into.
Oh, absolutely. Everyone does it.
And this trap is born out of predictive coding, right?
Right, which is the brain's hardwired desire to conserve energy. It always wants to rely on its most entrenched neural pathways.
Because the brain is basically an optimization machine.
It really is. I mean, it consumes roughly 20% of your body's metabolic energy.
Wow. 20%.
Yeah, just sitting there.
Yeah.
So it relentlessly tries to minimize effort. When you introduce a novel stimulus...
Like needing to speak English.
Exactly. When you need to communicate a complex idea in a new language, the brain doesn't want to forge a brand new, highly unpracticed neural circuit.
Either that's metabolically expensive.
Right. It takes too much energy. So instead, it routes the information through the superhighway it has spent decades building, which is your mother tongue.
Which sets up these 4 doomed steps. So step 1 is the genesis of the communication. It's the abstract thought.
The pure pre-linguistic concept.
Right, like the semantic intention before any actual vocabulary is assigned to it.
Exactly. It's just that raw network of firing neurons representing a desire or an observation or a need.
Okay, so then step 2 happens almost instantaneously. Your brain, because it wants to organize that abstract thought efficiently, wraps it in your dominant syntax.
It generates the internal sentence in your native language.
Right. And then we hit step 3, which is where the absolute catastrophe begins.
This is the mental translation phase.
You hold that native sentence in your working memory, and you attempt to systematically swap out the lexical items for English words.
While simultaneously trying to compute the grammatical realignments required by English syntax, it's exhausting.
Yeah, and then finally, step 4 is motor execution. You attempt to command your vocal cords, tongue, and lips to physically articulate that freshly computed English sentence.
If you even make it that far.
Right. Because the breakdown, according to our sources, happens squarely in the friction between step 2 and step 3.
That's where the system crashes.
But I want to push on why this fails so spectacularly. I mean, if the brain is an optimization machine,
which it is.
And associative learning, like connecting new info to known info, is how we learn basically everything else in life.
Yeah.
Why does routing through the native language cause the system to crash here?
Well, what's fascinating here is that it all comes down to the strict biological limits of working memory.
Okay, break that down for us.
So working memory is not a hard drive. It's a temporary processing workspace. It can only hold and manipulate a handful of variables at any given millisecond.
It's a very small desk.
Exactly. So when you execute step 3, you are requiring your working memory to hold the source sentence, then access the declarative memory bank to retrieve the target English vocabulary,
Right.
then analyze the syntactic rules of your native language, analyze the diverging syntactic rules of English, compute the necessary inversions or conjugations, and prepare the phonetic sequence for articulation.
That is just an insane amount of work. You're demanding a level of simultaneous computation that totally exceeds the cognitive buffer.
Yes. The cognitive load spikes massively, and when the load exceeds capacity, the frontal lobe simply aborts the process.
The system literally hangs.
It hangs, and you experience this as a blank stare and a frozen jaw.
Okay, let's unpack this with an analogy because I think it helps visualize it.
Yeah.
It's like trying to fly from New York to London.
Okay.
But your brain insists on connecting through Tokyo simply because it's a route it has flown 10,000 times before.
Oh, I love that.
Like, it feels incredibly safe and familiar to the brain's routing software, but practically, it is a catastrophic waste of time and fuel.
It's wildly inefficient.
Exactly. You're spending all your cognitive fuel navigating the Tokyo layover, which is the translation phase.
Yeah.
So by the time you actually need to land the plane and speak the English words, the tanks are completely empty.
That analogy perfectly isolates the mechanical flaw. Because the native language isn't a bridge like we think it is a massive, unnecessary detour.
So what's the solution?
Well, to achieve fluency, the sources make it very clear that you have to cancel the flight to Tokyo.
No more layovers.
None. You have to build a direct neural projection from the abstract concept in step 1 directly to the phonetic execution in step 4.
Just bypassing the native language entirely.
Yes.
Which, sounds amazing in theory.
Yeah.
But when you are looking at a textbook, the native translation is literally printed right next to the English word.
Right. It's unavoidable in traditional study.
So how do we actually sever that association in reality?
This is where the source material introduces a really powerful concept called the sensory anchor method.
Okay, the sensory anchor method.
Yeah, and it draws heavily on the principles of embodied cognition.
Mm-hmm.
The premise here is that human language did not evolve as some sterile academic phenomenon in a vacuum.
Right, we didn't evolve reading textbooks.
Exactly. Language evolved to describe our physical, spatial, and sensory reality.
So this is the theory of grounded cognition. We basically process language using the exact same sensory motor systems we use to physically interact with the world.
Precisely. For example, if I put you in an fMRI machine right now and I ask you to just read the word kick, the motor cortex in your brain, specifically the area that controls your leg, will physically light up.
Wait, really? Just from reading the word?
Just from reading it. Because the semantic meaning of the word is biologically intertwined with the physical action of kicking.
That is wild.
It is. And the sensory anchor method leverages this neurological reality to bypass translation.
Okay, so the guide uses a specific example to make this concrete, right?
Yeah.
The hot cup of coffee.
Yes, the hot cup. So the broken Tokyo layover method is to see the steam, feel the heat, internally trigger your native words for hot cup.
Let's say taza caliente, if you speak Spanish.
Right. And then you try to compute the English equivalent.
Which takes too long.
Way too long. But using a sensory anchor, you intentionally block the native phrase. You literally hold the mug, you focus your attention entirely on the thermal receptors in your palms registering the heat, you smell the roasted oils.
You're just totally present with the physical sensation.
Yes. And while your brain is actively processing that rich multisensory data, you directly overlay the English phonetic sequence, hot cup.
So you're binding the auditory pattern of the English words directly to the physical somatosensory experience.
You are forging a new synapse, so the next time you encounter a hot beverage, the thermal sensation itself acts as the retrieval cue for the English words.
Completely circumventing the lexical network of your native tongue.
Exactly.
Okay, I have to push back on this a little bit on behalf of the listener.
Sure, go ahead.
I'm trying to picture this in daily life. Am I supposed to walk around my office sniffing coffee and running my hands over the cold steel of the refrigerator and pointing at objects out loud just to learn adjectives?
Like a toddler.
Yeah, exactly, like a toddler. That feels completely impractical for anyone trying to acquire a sophisticated adult vocabulary.
It's a totally valid logistical critique, but anchoring doesn't require overt physical pantomime in public.
Oh, thank goodness.
Right. It actually requires intense, deliberate internal simulation. The brain is remarkably adept at simulation.
So you don't need the physical object right there in front of you.
No. If you're learning an abstract concept, you don't need a physical prop at all. You just need to recruit your somatic memory.
Give me an example of anchoring an abstract word without a prop. How would I do that?
Let's take the word exhausted.
Okay.
You don't need to run a marathon in the break room to anchor it. Instead of looking at a flashcard and linking exhausted to the translated equivalent in your native language, you just close your eyes for 3 seconds.
And then do what?
You deliberately simulate the physiological state of exhaustion.
Oh, I see.
You recall the feeling of lactic acid in heavy limbs. You remember the specific gravitational pull on your eyelids, or that deep involuntary sigh you exhale after a brutal 14-hour workday.
You're recreating the interoceptive feeling.
Yes, you're bringing up the actual physical memory of being tired.
And while I am internally simulating that heavy, depleted state, that's when I introduce the English target word.
Exactly. You bind the phonetic sound of exhausted to that internal physiological state. By doing this consistently, you construct a highly robust, non-linguistic retrieval cue.
So eventually, just the state of being tired will directly summon the English word.
With zero translation required.
That completely redefines what it means to study vocabulary. You aren't memorizing text on a page. You are essentially doing neuro-linguistic programming on yourself.
You're making the language three-dimensional.
I love that.
And it's highly effective for clearing that mental bottleneck at the single word level.
But, and there's always a but.
There is. The research points out a secondary, arguably much more destructive mechanism that kicks in the moment a learner actually tries to string these anchored words together in a real-time conversation.
Right, because knowing the words is one thing, but speaking them to a human is another. This is the physiological panic response.
Yes. The HPA axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, just goes into absolute overdrive.
And this panic is almost always triggered by a deeply ingrained, completely false metric for what fluency actually sounds like.
That's the root of the problem.
As learners, we assume fluency equates to velocity. Like we hear native speakers on television or in business meetings, and their speech just sounds like a relentless, unbroken wall of sound.
It sounds so fast to an untrained ear.
So the moment it's our turn to speak, we feel this immense, crushing pressure to eliminate all silence.
Which is a complete auditory illusion. When you analyze the spectrograms of natural native speech, it is riddled with hesitation phenomena.
Micropauses.
Endless micropauses. We're talking fractional silences, filler sounds, elongated vowel.
Like saying, or drawing out a word.
Right. These are not defects of speech. They are vital articulatory and cognitive planning windows.
Okay, say more about that. Why are they vital?
Native speakers utilize these micropauses constantly to navigate syntactic boundaries, to retrieve low-frequency vocabulary, and honestly, simply to breathe.
But the language learner interprets any silence as a catastrophic failure of intellect.
Yes.
Yes, exactly.
If we pause for even half a second, we assume the person listening thinks we are stupid. So we rush. We try to force the newly anchored words out at a completely unnatural velocity.
And that rushing is what triggers the biological cascade. When you attempt to speak faster than your phonetic planning allows, you stumble.
Right.
And that stumble is perceived by your amygdala as a social threat.
The brain's alarm system goes off.
Exactly. The amygdala signals the adrenal glands to flood the bloodstream with cortisol.
The stress hormone. And this is where the neuroscience gets incredibly disruptive to traditional language teaching. Because cortisol doesn't just make your palms sweat or make you feel nervous.
No.
It physically degrades your ability to speak.
It is a direct antagonist to memory retrieval.
Wow.
Yeah. The hippocampus, which is the brain structure, heavily responsible for declarative memory retrieval like pulling those anchored English words out of storage, it's densely packed with glucocorticoid receptors.
Okay, so what happens when the cortisol hits those receptors? When cortisol floods the brain, it binds to these receptors and actively inhibits synaptic transmission in the hippocampus.
So by rushing to prove how fluent you are, you're literally drugging your own brain with a neurochemical that makes it biologically impossible to access your vocabulary.
It's brutal. It's a closed loop trap.
Walk us through the loop.
The fear of forgetting causes you to rush. Rushing induces physiological stress. Stress spikes your cortisol. Cortisol shuts down the hippocampus. You freeze. And the freeze generates even more stress.
Here's where it gets really interesting for me. It makes me think about playing jazz.
Oh, I like this.
Yeah, so the great jazz musicians always emphasize that the music isn't just the notes you play. It is the negative space. It's the silence between the notes.
Right.
If you just hammer every single key on a saxophone as fast as humanly possible without taking a breath, it's not music. It's an auditory assault.
Just noise.
Exactly. The pauses, the rhythmic breathing, that is what creates the cadence. That is what actually allows the listener's brain to parse and digest the melodic phrasing.
Language is auditory jazz. That's a perfect way to look at it. If you strip out the micropauses, you destroy the prosody. You overwhelm the listener's processing capacity, and you completely redline your own cognitive engine.
So if cortisol is physically blocking the hippocampus, then this isn't a vocabulary issue at all. It is entirely a nervous system regulation issue.
Entirely.
Does that mean physiological hacks like intentional box breathing or actively slowing our physical gestures while speaking are actually viable primary language acquisition tools?
They are not just viable, they are a prerequisite for fluent production. The source material advocates strongly for the deliberate normalization of the micropause.
Giving yourself permission to stop.
Yes, by actively giving yourself permission to pause, you create the necessary window for a slow diaphragmatic breath.
Which stimulates the vagus nerve.
Exactly. Engaging the vagus nerve activates the parasympathetic nervous system. It forces your heart rate to decelerate.
Telling your body you're safe.
Right. It signals to the amygdala that you are not under threat, which halts the secretion of cortisol.
And then the magic happens.
Exactly. As the cortisol clears, the hippocampus comes back online, and your sensory-anchored vocabulary becomes instantly accessible again.
It is just astonishing to me how much of language learning is just militant state management. If you can control your breathing, you control your access to the lexicon.
You must decouple the act of speaking from the physiological stress response. True fluency requires a state of relaxed alertness.
Right. But clearing the cortisol and accessing single words doesn't magically teach you how to build a coherent paragraph.
That's true.
You might be perfectly calm, your vagus nerve might be fully engaged, but if you are still mentally gluing one isolated English word to the next, hoping they form a coherent structure, you are going to stumble.
Yes, you will.
Which leads us to the final and perhaps most complex hurdle, syntactic processing.
The habit of word-by-word sentence construction, it really is the final remnant of the translation mindset.
When learners try to speak, they often treat language like driving a car while staring intensely at the pavement directly 3 inches in front of their front tires.
That's a great image.
Right. They are micromanaging every single inch of the road. This noun, then this verb, then this preposition. And when you drive like that, you inevitably swerve all over the place and crash. You are hyper-focused on the immediate structural mechanics.
And the cognitive load of computing syntax linearly, word by word like that, is simply unsustainable for fluid communication.
So to fix this, the sources introduce something called conceptual mapping and the natural fluency shift.
Right.
And the core directive here is to look at the horizon. Stop staring at the tires.
Think about it. When you look at the horizon while driving, your peripheral vision and your motor systems naturally microcorrect the steering wheel to keep you centered in the lane.
You don't even think about it.
Exactly. Conceptual mapping operates on the exact same neurological principle. You lock your conscious attention entirely onto the destination, the core semantic meaning, the actual concept you want to transmit to the listener.
Okay, wait, I have to challenge this.
Go for it.
If I don't consciously compute the grammar, how does looking at the destination magically summon the correct English preposition or verb tense?
Yeah.
Are we just throwing abstract concepts at people and hoping they understand?
Yeah.
Because if the knowledge isn't there, focusing on the vibe of the conversation isn't going to fix my subject-verb agreement.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, it doesn't summon magic. It triggers pattern recognition and chunking.
Chunking.
Yes, this is a critical mechanism in psycholinguistics. The human brain does not store native language as an isolated dictionary of single words governed by an abstract rulebook of grammar.
How does it store it?
It stores language in pre-assembled, multi-word, multi-syllabic phrases known as lexical chunks or lexical bundles.
Oh, like the phrase "as a matter of fact" or "at the end of the day."
Exactly. We don't construct those word by word.
No, we don't think at, then, and end.
Right. We retrieve the entire block of text as a single unit of meaning.
Oh, wow.
When native speakers communicate, they are primarily chaining together these highly rehearsed lexical chunks. Their conscious mind is focused on the conceptual horizon, the point they want to make.
And because their attention is on the meaning.
Their subconscious pattern recognition system rapidly retrieves the appropriate lexical chunks that have been mapped to that meaning in the past.
So the natural fluency shift is essentially the transition from trying to compute grammar from scratch using discrete words to allowing your brain to retrieve pre-assembled chunks of language based purely on the semantic destination.
Yes. When you fixate on grammar, when you stare at the tires, you actively disrupt the brain's automatic retrieval of these chunks.
You're getting in your own way.
Exactly. You force the brain to deconstruct the language into parts, which spikes cognitive load and invites errors. By focusing on the conceptual map, you allow the brain to utilize its predictive coding. It anticipates the words needed to reach the concept.
It's a radical act of trust. You have to trust the sensory anchors you've built. You have to breathe through the micro pauses to keep the cortisol down. And then you have to throw your conscious mind out to the horizon of the conversation and just trust that your subconscious pattern recognition will supply the stepping stones.
It feels risky, but empirically, when learners make this shift, their error rate paradoxically drops.
Oh, it drops.
Yes, their prosody improves, their speed naturally optimizes, and the crippling fatigue of speaking a second language vanishes.
Because they aren't micromanaging every syllable anymore.
Because they are finally utilizing the brain's natural linguistic architecture rather than fighting it.
This entire deep dive really reconfigures the landscape for anyone struggling to cross the fluency threshold. I mean, we've totally dismantled the illusion of efficiency. The native language isn't helping you. It's a computational bottleneck that overloads working memory.
The Tokyo layover must be eliminated.
Gone. And you bypass it through embodied cognition, using sensory anchors to fuse English phonetics directly to physical sensations and interoceptive states.
You protect your retrieval systems by mastering your physiology, embracing the micropause, stimulating the vagus nerve, and preventing the cortisol blockade of the hippocampus.
And finally, you abandon the exhausting linear computation of syntax. You stop staring at the pavement, you look at the conceptual horizon, and you rely on chunking and pattern recognition to carry the narrative flow.
The architecture for native-like fluency is completely available to the adult learner. It is simply a matter of removing the manufactured friction.
Which leaves me with a final, slightly philosophical provocation to consider.
Okay, let's hear it.
We've spent this entire time strategizing on how to surgically remove our mother tongue from our real-time cognitive processing, right? We want to bypass it completely so we can inhabit English directly.
To experience the world without the native filter?
Right. But if you consider the theory of linguistic relativity, the idea that the structure of our language actually shapes our very cognition, our native language is the fundamental architecture of our reality.
It's how we seed everything.
Exactly. Every memory, every trauma, every nuance of our identity has been encoded through the specific syntactic and lexical boundaries of our mother tongue.
It is the operating system of the self.
So my question for you, the listener, to analyze long after this deep dive concludes is this. When you successfully execute this natural fluency shift, when you train your brain to directly anchor to sensory reality in a brand new linguistic framework, entirely bypassing the mother tongue, do you just learn to speak a new language, or do you fundamentally alter the boundaries of your own consciousness?
Wow.
Right, like when the filter changes, does the person change with it?
It really suggests that true fluency is not just an acquisition of skill, but an expansion of identity.
Something to think about the next time you feel the urge to rush past a moment of silence. Let the pause happen, take a breath, and look at the horizon. Until next time.